Good morning. Shabbat Shalom and welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning scripture study coming to you live from St. Francisville, Louisiana. It is finally a little bit cooler here in Louisiana. I hope it's a beautiful day where you are. I just wanted to say thank you for joining us today. There are a lot of things you could do on a Saturday morning, hopefully none of which involve physical labor, but you're here with us in a time of refreshing and study, and I appreciate your time very much. We are currently in a study, an examination, if you will, of the 5 books. The Pentateuch, a new look is what we're calling this series. I wanted to take just a second before I get into the material today and remind you, every week now, generally Monday through Wednesday, it depends on my schedule, we're putting out a United Israel Bulletin. You can sign up for the bulletin on the website. Now, we get a really low rate of read. In other words, when I get the stats in, it tells me who's reading the bulletin and who's not. So I know if you're reading this thing that I'm spending time on. Actually, the reason I bring this up is sometimes I wonder if people who've signed up for the bulletin are actually getting the bulletin. It could be going to your spam folder or something like that. So make sure you check and make sure that you're signed up for the bulletin. And the reason I bring it up is that every week we have new information, biblical data. Sometimes it's articles that are posted on our website. Like this last one, Ralph Bunton submitted a new article on a look back series. I put that up. Betty Given writes for us frequently. Sometimes it's the Tylers, Tabor, might be something that I write. And then recently, Lyndon has been contributing quite a bit in terms of the Torah readings, the weekly Parsha. And so what we'll do is she finds links that might help you. They're either fun and entertaining or just educational resources from various places on the web. And we put those in the bulletin so you can spend a few days actually studying the material in this particular Parsha before the weekly study session on Saturday. So I just want to remind you, look at that, see if you're signed up. If you're not, go to UnitedIsraelWorldUnion.com and you can sign up for the bulletin there. I encourage you to do that. So we are in the book of Genesis. Bereshit in Hebrew is the title of the book. These titles were not part of the original documents. They're later put into the text. So Genesis comes to us from, through the Greek and so forth, and Bereshit, the Hebrew, none of that is part of the original, but it's a way that we categorize these books, these ancient stories, and we're currently working through the Book of Beginnings, as it's called. We're following broadly, and I say broadly for a very specific reason, we're broadly following the annual cycle of readings which comes to us from Babylon. And yet these particular readings are simply an arrangement of the material of the 5 books such that a person who reads and studies according to this set structure will at the end of a calendar year have worked through the entirety of the Pentateuch. This is an ancient system. It's not the most ancient. The earlier system is that which was used in the land of Israel, and it dates to the Second Temple times, and it is a 3.5 year cycle of readings called the triennial cycle. We've gone through that in previous teaching cycles, but now we're going through the annual cycle of reading, which broadly follows the annual cycle of readings. But when I say broadly, the reason that I'm not actually sticking to the precise boundaries of this annual cycle of reading is because it's arbitrary in some ways. The divisions that were put together for the annual cycle of reading in Babylon don't really follow they don't align so well with the original structure of the book or books. So whenever I open up the material, for instance, this week, if you look at your handy Jewish calendar that United Israel sent you, or will send you if you email me and request one, you'll notice that the reading, the parsha, the portion this week is called Lech Lecha. Lech Lecha. It begins in chapter 12, verse 1, and runs all the way through the end of chapter 17. I believe it's Genesis 17, verse 27. That section of text doesn't quite break where I need it to break. And that's not because of failure on my part, but it's because the division of the annual cycle doesn't align with the ancient storytelling structure that was part of the original document. But be that as it may, we're going to use the annual cycle as sort of a broad structure, and then I'll dip back into previous and extend a little bit if I need to break it the proper way. So Genesis, or Bereshit, the first book of the 5 that we're now working in, is stitched together or carried along, if you will, by a series of stories within the story. It's seldom noticed by students of the book, by teachers of the book, by scholars of the material, that this ancient structure is just right under the surface. And that's what we're looking at. Each of these stories, each of these connecting pieces, each of these ancient sources the reader is alerted to them by 2 words, Eleh Toledoth, typically translated in your English translations, whatever translation you use, typically it's translated as, these are the generations. These are the generations. The literal, more accurate Hebrew, which is presented in Dr. James Tabor's work on Genesis, would translate that these are the bringings forth. Bringings forth, plural bringings. These are the bringings forth. And there are 10 of these in all. So if you took the book of Genesis and separated it from the rest of your Bible, and you just read it from beginning to end, you would notice 10 of these that say, Eleh Toledoth. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth. These are the generations of Noah. These are the generations of the sons of Noah, and so forth. And these particular stories within the story are instructive, and they provide us a sort of a pattern whereby to separate the material and truly then dig into the material that's in front of us. Now, some of these, of the 10 of these, Eleh Toledoth, these are the generations, or these are the bringings forth, there are 10 of these. Some of these are very, very short. Some of these are rather lengthy, like in today's, the one that we begin today actually covers several chapters. In fact, it runs quite a few. I'll talk about that in just a moment. Last week's class, we covered 2 of these in one. We covered Eleh Toledoth Noach and Eleh Toledoth B'nai Noach. These are the generations. These are the bringings forth of Noah, and these are the bringings forth of the sons of Noah. So we're really dealing last week, not this week. Last week, we're dealing with Noah and his family, the story of Noah, the family of Noah, the epic of Noah. And you can go back and listen to that on our YouTube or our Facebook page if you miss that. But there are all sorts of other structural things, patterns, that are evident in the book and in the books that we're going to cover and in the book of books. So anytime you're looking at the biblical narrative, you have to recognize these most ancient breaks where sources are pulled together. You've heard me say over and over, when I'm reading in a text, I'll say, there is a white space here. These are one sort of breaks. You have 2 types of white spaces which separate paragraphs and basically ancient pages of text. And then you have these such as we're dealing with in Genesis, these clearly designated sections of text. So one other thing that you'll notice when you look at a book, particular in Genesis, we're going to look at this. There are 10 generations from Adam to Noah, and then there are 10 more when we pick up from Shem to Avram. Now, I believe that that is just the way it fell out. In other words, there are likely 10 generations, literally, from Adam to Noah, and then there are 10 more from Noah's son Shem all the way down to Avram. But it's an order, you see, and the ancient scribes made sure to draw this out as they put the book together. When we get to this second grouping of 10 generations, we begin it with Shem. Now, Shem is a son of Noah. Remember, Noah has 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japhet. And these 3 sons make up, according to the biblical narrative at least, all of humanity. In fact, the rabbis would later come to designate all of humanity as B'nai Noah. So if you're a descendant, if you're alive and breathing today, you trace your genealogy back to Noah. I remember one of my kids, I can't remember which one, I have 6 children, as many of you know, and one of them, I think it was Zach, went to school. It was Zach, I remember this now. He went to school, and a little boy in his classroom said he was a descendant of a famous person by the name of Benjamin Franklin. And all the class oohed and ahed. They were amazed that this child was a descendant of Benjamin Franklin. Whether he was or not, I don't know. But Zach was disappointed because we didn't have anybody famous in our family that he could report to the class. And I told him that is not so. I said, we do have somebody famous that everybody knows. And he said, who? I said, Noah. He said, Noah? Like in the Bible, Noah? I said, absolutely. And I saw he was so impressed with that, I told him we were also descendants of Adam and Eve. And the next day, the child goes to class, and he was the hero, at least in the minds of the other third graders. So think about that. But according to the biblical narrative, we all descend from Noah. And so, but what the Bible begins to do is shift the focus. So for instance, whenever we're dealing with the text of Bereshit, of Genesis, from Adam to Noah, it's totally universal. The book deals with all of humanity. Every human that's alive today fits within that first 11 chapters. It's relevant for the entire world, so to speak. Now, I actually believe that even beyond that, there's relevance. But at least according to the rabbinic system, those chapters are yours if you're not of Israelite descent. But after you get to Noah, the scribe, the redactor, the person, thankfully, who pulled all these ancient sources together, wants to direct our attention not to all of the children of Noah, but to one of the sons of Noah by the name of Shem. And because from Shem forward, we're in essence beginning to focus on a singular man and his family. From Genesis chapter 12 on, we're dealing with God's dealings in history and in the future with one family, one particular family. In fact, the prophet Amos will later say famously that you, Israel, have I known of all the families of the earth. So the focus becomes the descendants of Shem. Now, Shem is the father of the Shemites, or we might say in more popular term that many of you are familiar with, that these are the Semitic people. So some of you might not know that the term Semitic. Like if somebody talks about, oh, that's anti-Semitic. Well, it's talking about this branch of people, of humans that descend from Shem. Shem is our focus. So I'm going to go with me to chapter 9, verse 26. And when I need to use a very literal translation, I do have Dr. Tabor's book, but this is convenient for me now. Chapter 9, verse 26. Remember last week I told you that Noah is not depicted in the book of Genesis and the Pentateuch as a preacher of righteousness who's trying to save a world which is about to be destroyed, preaching a sermon on the street corners of the ancient place that he lived, but he doesn't speak at all according to the text. According to the text, there's no dialogue with Noah until after the flood. This is part of Noah's 3-line words that he spoke according to our record. 9:26 says, "Blessed be Jehovah, the God of Shem. Let Canaan be a slave to them. May God enlarge Japhet, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be a slave to them." So he's talking about his 3 sons. And you remember the incident. Noah's drunk, falls asleep, whatever happens, happens. And this is what he says. Now, of those sons, notice that the blessing, if you will, the positive remark, the good thing, goes to Shem. Somewhat to Japhet, who will be included in some way with Shem, but Shem gets the better end of the stick here, okay? So we're going to focus now on Shem. We're going to be focused on the descendants of the Semite line, and in particular, one whose name, as far as the Bible tells us, is Terach. Terach. Now, a lot of people don't know who Terach is, but he's important. What we have is, if you follow the line from Noah to Shem, you work your way down, you come to this particular person by the name of Terach. Terach's generations, or Terach, the bringing forths of Terach, are the focus of our study today. Now, we're only going to begin to look at this ancient story within the story of Genesis, because the section that we see today, it actually began in last week's reading, but the person who compiled this reading cycle, Annual Readings in Babylon, didn't follow the order of the original book. But in chapter 11 and verse 27 of Genesis, last week's Parsha, there is the beginning of the Eleh Toledoth Terach. These are the bringings forth of Terach. And it runs from 11:27 all the way through chapter 25. I'm going to read you the beginning and the end of it so you see what I'm structuring here for the next 3 weeks. Because for 3 weeks, it's going to take me 3 weeks to work through the material of Eleh Toledoth Terach. Go with me to Genesis chapter 11. Genesis chapter 11 and verse 27. Genesis 11:27. And it says, now this is the line of Terach. This is the JPS, or Tabor's translation will say, these are the bringings forth of Terach. Terach begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran begot Lot. So this ancient book begins with the birth of Avram. Straight out of the chute. The first thing you hear, we're talking about the bringings forth of Terach. The most famous of all is Avram. So the Eleh Toledoth Terach begins like that. Now go all the way with me to chapter 25, Genesis 25. This is the end of Eleh Toledoth Terach. It ends this way. Chapter 25 of Genesis, verse 11. This is the very last verse in Eleh Toledoth Terach. After the death of Avraham, God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac settled near Be'er Lahai Roi. So it begins with the birth of one named Abram, and this ancient book within the book of Genesis ends with the death of Avraham. Now you know this, and I know this, but you're supposed to play like you don't, that Abram and Avraham are the same. So really, the Eleh Toledoth Terach is a book about Abraham. So you and I are going to study the book of Abraham. So I know John Langberg, Abraham is one of his heroes. And I think he'll be happy to tell you the same. When we went to Israel, and John and Lyndon went with us on the Tanakh tour, a highlight was going to the tomb in Hebron and actually going to that place. So we're going to be talking about Abraham. Now, Abraham is someone who connects, if you will, all the Western religions of the world. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all look to Abraham. Think about that. It's one thing that everyone, roughly, there are roughly 2 billion Muslims, there are roughly 2 billion Christians, and, say 15, 16, 20 million Jews worldwide. And if you you're talking about over half of the world's population looks to Abraham. All right? So this idea of Abrahamic faith, is something that is core to the human race. So half of humanity today looks to Abraham. So we're going to be talking about Abraham. Now, while you're in chapter 25, and I just showed you the end of Eleh Toledoth Terach, let me show you the beginning of the next book. It's the next verse 12 of chapter 25. This is the line of Ishmael. And by the way, this is a short Eleh Toledoth, that really literally, and what Tabor would translate is, these are the bringings forth of Ishmael. And then if you look down to verse 19, look, this little book within the book is only 7 verses long. Because if you look down to verse 19, it says, Eleh Toledoth Yitzhak. These are the bringings forth of Isaac. So you have to follow the ancient structure of the book that the scribe, that the final redactor is using to pull us along, is a series of 10. These are the generations of. These are the generations of. It just carries you along. It's an excellent order. Sadly, most people don't know that. So again, today's class is the first of 3 classes which will cover the material related to Terach's bringings forth, the chief of which, that which clearly stands out, is one of the sons of Terach called Avram. The beginning of the book of Terach, of the generations of Terach, begins with Avram's birth, and by the end, we have the death of one named Abraham. In fact, in the material that we're going to cover today, at the beginning, he's called Avram, and by the end of the few chapters we're going to cover today, his name has been changed, as has the name of his wife. His name has been changed from Avram to Avraham. Now, scholars debate what does the actual name mean? What is the etiology, or what is the etymology of these words? Avram is typically understood, at least folk etymology, according to the Bible. Avram means an exalted father. Avraham is, we are told, according to the text, that it means a father of many nations, So it's like he's exalted in one sense, but he gets more exalted as the story unfolds. So go with me, please, this morning to the book of Yeshayahu, Isaiah 51, Isaiah 51. Isaiah 51, beginning in verse 1. Listen to me. I'm reading. I'm also telling you, listen to me, all of you out there. listen to me, you who chase righteousness. You chasers of righteousness, listen up. I think that's all of you today. Everyone who hears the sound of my voice today, you are a chaser of righteousness. Another idea for a t-shirt, the chasers of righteousness. Somebody write that down. We're liable to do that. Hey, Mark, chasers of righteousness. Look to the rock from which you were hewn, to the quarry from which you were dug. Look back to Avraham your father, and to Sarah who brought you forth, for he was only one when I called him, but I blessed him and I made him many. Isaiah 51 tells us that there's a miracle coming in this story. We're going from Abram, one man, to many. Many, many. Many, many, many. And to bring this about, as you'll see, requires the miraculous intervention of El Shaddai, of the God known by various forms of the name El at the time, was not known by the divine name, the Tetragrammaton. But El Shaddai blesses this one named Avram, and he goes from one to many. So I'm going to be focused a little bit on this class, on this idea of going from one to many. We're going to have, by the way, you're going to see in a future class the origin, the original, I should say, miraculous birth story, greater than anything you've ever heard. A miraculous birth story that really happened. And it happened in the ancient world. It actually happened a few times, but we'll get into that. So Isaiah 51, God says, I called him, I blessed him, I multiplied him. When I read that last night, I thought, you know, if I was a popular megachurch preacher, that would preach. Called, blessed, and multiplied. Right? I mean, it really would. And it should inspire us, because this story is based upon the calling of a man, the blessing of a man, and the multiplication of this particular man. Now, this part of our story is only half of the story from a high level. If I look at the 3 weeks that I'm going to cover this material from a very high level, I see it split in two major headings. So get these. Number one is this idea of out of one person, there's going to be many. So you start with one and it's multiplied. All right? Now, I usually would lean towards Hebrew language things that I would share with you, but today I'm going to give you a little bit of Latin on top of everything. So the Latin way that we would say out of one many would be ex uno multis. Ex uno multis. And that means out of one many. So that's half the story. Half the story deals with Avram, it being one person and multiplying. Now, there's another half. And the other half is important because it deals with Avram's thought processes, with his theological understanding, with his awareness of deity. And the second part is the exact opposite of the Latin phrase ex uno multis. It's the exact opposite. Rather than like Avraham is out of one many, the exact opposite, his theological growth is the Latin phrase that many of you probably know already. E pluribus unum. You didn't know you were going to get some Latin this morning. Now, what does e pluribus unum mean? I think everybody knows this. You in the room answer it to yourself, but if you're at home, shout it. What does it mean? E pluribus unum is out of many, one. What does that have to do with Avram, with Abraham? What is that? What does out of out of many one. But this speaks not of people in the Eleh Toledoth Terach, but of God. Because Avram goes from a multiplicity of deity to a singular God. Now, I know the Midrashim, and I know the stories about the great iconoclast Avram, but that's not biblical. Let me tell you about the biblical Avram. What was Avram? Was he a saint, a holy one living in Ur of the Chaldees and, following the righteous ways of the one God in that? That's not what we read. Go to Joshua 24. Joshua 24. Joshua 24. And we're going to read verse 2 and the first part of 3. Then Joshua 24:2, said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, in olden times your forefathers, Terach, father of Abraham and father of Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Avraham from beyond the Euphrates and led him through the whole land of Canaan and multiplied his offspring." Now I want you to notice something. It talks about, in ancient times, your forefathers, Terach, father of Avraham, father of Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates, and the English covers this up in the Jewish Study Bible. But in the Hebrew it says, and they worshipped Elohim Akarim. These are idolaters. They. Abraham is one of the they. I know that's not popular, but I love the idea that someone who was an idolater comes to the truth of the one God. And let me tell you why I love it. Because it's my story too. And it's probably your story as well. And it's the story of all who make that journey of faith. Avraham is the father of the faithful. He, like you, was an idolater who comes to the truth, and God used him mightily and can use you as well. Let's quit taking the biblical characters and painting them into some unachievable status that even the writers of the biblical text don't do. Joshua 24 clearly tells us that Abram is not an iconoclast, as later Jewish literature wants to paint, but is part of a family of idolaters. So, at the highest level, Avram or Avraham goes from one to many. We're dealing with the promise of progeny, ex uno multis. This is Avraham. But only after. In other words, this gift of God going from one to many is contingent on his reception of the call to leave the many and become one in terms of theological belief. Are you willing to go from the multiplicity of deity that you have where you are to a one God program? And if you are, I will bless you. I will multiply you. That's the deal. Avram passes with flying colors. So only after he follows the call of God and the theological direction of that call, going from many to one, e pluribus unum, from other gods to no other gods, only then will the promise be fulfilled. Okay? Joshua 24:3 says, I took your father Avraham from beyond the Euphrates. In Hebrew, it doesn't say Euphrates. It says beyond the river. Hanahar, the river. Now, it doesn't give you a name of the river. It just says the river. All right? The question becomes what river? So if you look down at chapter 24, verse 14, remember, this is Joshua to the assembled Israelites later in history, during the conquest, right? Excuse me. And he says, verse 14, 24, now therefore revere the Lord and serve him with undivided loyalty. Put away the gods that your forefathers served beyond the Euphrates and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. Or, if you are loath to serve the Lord, choose this day which ones you are going to serve. The God that your forefathers served beyond the Euphrates, or those of the Amorites in whose land you are settled, but I and my household will serve the Lord. How many people have that in your kitchen? That nice little slogan. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Right? So it's a great verse to put on in your house. Right? Joshua is saying to the people of Israel, look, your forefathers, he's already told them that Terach and his boys were a family of idolaters on the other side of the river. Now, I have my handy map here today because I want to show you the river. They're right. When translators say Euphrates, this is the river they're talking about. Notice, here's the Persian here. And up, it branches into two main branches. On the western side, this is the river Parat in Hebrew. Parat, Euphrates, Parat. You hear the middle part is at least the same. Has to do with fruitfulness. And you can imagine along a main water source that it generates fruitfulness, life. The other river is called the Tigris. So we have the eastern branch is the Tigris. The western branch is called the Euphrates, biblically called Parat. Now, this river, by the way, is the eastern border of the land promised to Abram. Okay? Now, just so you see, here's the little land of Israel right here on a modern map. But when you read, and it's part of this parsha, when you read about the land given or promised to Avram, he's told that the eastern boundary is the great river, Parat. Now, a lot of people say, yay, Israel's going to get all that. Well, we didn't say Israel. We're talking about Abraham. Now, I know everyone wants to make Abraham the first Jew. There's no such thing as Jews yet. Jews come later in our understanding of familial breakdown. That's a part of Israel. By the way, in Abraham's time, there is no Israel yet, not in our story yet, because Abraham has to have Isaac, who has to have Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel. So we're not talking about Israelites, we're not talking about Jews. We're talking about God takes Avram and he gives him a large area of land for his descendants, some of which will later be Israelites and Jews, but some aren't. So when you see people posting on the internet, here's the greater Israel, don't be greedy, people. That's not all your land. That's the land of Abraham's descendants, some of which are Israelites. So let's keep that straight. We're going to get into that more and more. Now, here's something that I want you to understand, that when Avram and the family, some of his family, when they cross over the river, it says, it uses the Hebrew verb avar, to cross over or to pass over, you know. And that particular verb, many suggest, and I adhere to this, I believe that this is right, that avar, being the root of the term Hebrew, Hebrew is called ivri or ivrit in the construct. But the idea is that a person who is called a Hebrew, what you're really saying is that this is the person who crossed over. So if you look with me at Genesis 14, this is the first occurrence of this. Abram is known to the people of the land as a sojourner. You know, he's a stranger in this land, if you will. He's not from here. Where are you from, boy? It's from the other side, right? He's the one who crossed over. So in Genesis 14:13, part of our story today, a fugitive brought the news to Avram the Ivri, who was dwelling at the terebinths of Mamre, the Amorite, kinsman of Eshcol and Aner, these being Abram's allies. So here, just unannounced, Avram is called a Hebrew. So it's really what it's saying is that this fugitive comes to Avram, the one who crossed over. He's known by that, you know. He's known as the person, he's an immigrant, if you will. He's come across the border. This is the idea of Avram. And not only is Avram one who crossed over physically, the prat, but, get this, he also crossed over spiritually. He made a crossover, and I don't think this is taking too much liberty with the text. He goes from believing in the many gods, the multiplicity of deity, to the one God. That's the spiritual crossing. All right. So the question becomes, where specifically is Avram from? Now, I know a lot of people are going, oh, I know, and they're putting answers up. Well, that depends. What do you mean it depends? Everyone knows where he's from. Well, let's look and see what the Bible says, and let's follow this through. This is important. I'm giving you some data on the historical Avram. What can we know? I want you to see where he's from. I want you to get some of the basic text down because we're going to build on this in the next two classes. So remember, I have 3 weeks to do this. So where is he from? If you look with me at Genesis 11 and verse 28. Well, we'll start at 27. And these are the bringings forth of Terach. Terach brought forth Avram, Nahor, and Haran brought forth Lot. And Haran died upon the face of Terach his father, in the land of those brought forth of his, in Ur of the Chaldeans. In Hebrew, it's Ur Kasdim. Okay, Ur of the Chaldeans. And Avram took and Nahor for themselves women. The name of the one woman of Abram was Sarai, and the name of the woman of Nahor was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and the father of Iscah. And Sarah was barren. There was not to her a child. And Terach took Avram his son, and Lot, son of Haran, son of his son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, woman of Avram, his son, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to walk the land of Canaanward. In other words, to walk in the direction of Canaan. And they came to Haran and they sat there, they dwelled there. So, we have two passages here which indicate to us that Avram, the Ivri, the one who crossed over, is from Ur Kasdim. Okay, so if I look here on my map, you're going to see that Ur is located towards the origin of, or right here at the base in my map of the Euphrates River. You know, it's in the southern portion. All right. Now, this is our first encounter with that. Now let's look. So right now in your notes, where is Abram from? He's from Ur Kasdim. Ur Kasdim. Now, by the way, this map, you know, some people put it here, a little bit. I mean, look, it's an ancient place, and we have some archaeology to back up where Ur is, and a little bit that we know about that. I won't be getting into that now. Look at Genesis 15 and verse 7. According to our text, this is God speaking, and he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to assign this land to you as a possession. Okay, there we go. That's 3, Ur Kasdim. Now look, there's one more. Go with me to the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah chapter 9, Nehemiah 9 and verse 7. You are the Lord God who chose Avram, who brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans and changed his name to Abraham. All right, there you go. That's 4. 4 of these texts indicate clearly Ur of the Chaldeans. Now, in 11:27 through 32 of Genesis, we read that the trip that he took, it's not just Avram, but it's Terach and his brother's son, and the family, basically, small family. They go from Ur all the way up to a place called Haran. Okay? Now this journey, it's along an ancient route. This would have, it would have been the travel route. Basically, people would, you can imagine, they would follow along the river. It certainly beats, and we have other routes that go all the way across this real big desert. There were trade routes that did that. That's a little bit rougher trip, especially when you have a family. But this trip is from here to there. Best I can tell on some map searches, you're talking roughly 600 miles, okay? And I know we have people who use that other system of measurement. 600 miles, you can Google miles to kilometer and get your exact figure. But the thing is, they go to Haran. That's with a het, not a hay. They go from Ur Kasdim to Haran. Now look at Genesis 12:1 with me, because I want to ask you a question, and let's begin to think about. Remember, there are a lot of people who are teaching through the weekly Torah portions, as they're called, and they're giving you the standard biblical class. Here's what we know. We're not pointing out any difficulties, and that's usually because they don't see any difficulties, right? I have to be honest with you. But they present the story. Here it is. This is exactly the way they would say, as Moses wrote it, and they would miss many valuable things, clues, important points. The purpose of this class is to let you really see what it really says and not follow the traditional beliefs that people have kind of passed on without verification. So if we look at chapter 12, by the way, let's finish up chapter 11, verse 32. The days of Terach came to 205 years, and Terach died in Haran. Okay, so Avram's dad is dead. He dies here. Now, look at the next verse. And the Lord said to Avram, Lech lecha, go for yourself from your native land, from your father's house, to the land that I will show you. Okay. Now I have some questions. Where's the land of Abram again? Where is the land of his kindred? You can say, well, the house of his father is in Haran. Okay. According to the presented order of the narrative, he has already left Ur. Remember, we have 4 or 5 verses where God says, I called you out of Ur of the Chaldeans. 11:27 says, he leaves Ur of the Chaldeans, he goes to Haran. They're there, Terach dies, and then we read, go for yourself, leave your native land. Now, my question is, does chapter 12, is it just out of order? In other words, is this reporting an incident that, don't answer yet. Some of you think you're going to say, well, here's what I know it means. Don't do that to yourself because you might get it wrong. So, but is chapter 12 reporting an incident that happened here? And then that leads him to go to Haran with his dad and his brother? Or is the call in chapter 12 to leave Haran? Okay, it's going to make sense. So is God saying, look, Abram, you're in Haran. I know you're in Haran. I'm going to ask you to leave that place which he's going to refer to as your native land. Is it his native land? Is Haran his native land? Is it the land of his kindred, his bringings forth, where he was born? He's born here, according to that. Okay. Now, go to chapter 24 of Genesis. Go to 24. See, I know I'm not going to look because I know people are going to start saying, here's what, got to wait. Chapter 24. And verse 1 through 4. Avraham was old, advanced in years. The Lord had blessed Avraham in all these things. And Avraham said to the senior servant of his household who had charge of all that he owned, put your hand under my thigh and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven, the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but will go to the land of my birth and get a wife for my son Isaac. All right, go to the land of my birth. Now, question is, does the servant, some think it's Eleazar, but it's not named, is he going to go to Haran or is he going to go to Ur? The land of his birth is Ur Kasdim, according to 4 or 5 text. That's not where he goes. He goes to Aram Naharaim. Look at verse 10. The servant took 10 of his master's camels and set out, taking with him all the bounty of his master, and he made his way to Aram Naharaim, to the city of Nahor. Okay, so they're in the land here, and he says to his servant, I need you to get a girl for my boy, but don't do it among these people here. These people are heathen, right? I want you to go to my birthplace. And he goes to this area here, Padan Aram, okay? Now this brings up some questions, and we're going to talk a little bit about this. This particular, where it says Aram Naharaim, that indicates, it means Aram between 2 rivers. Aram between 2 rivers. I know I keep going back and forth. That's the handy thing about these chairs. What 2 rivers? Here are the 2 rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This swath of land is what we are being told is the birthplace, if you will. It's broad. It's like somebody goes, where were you born, Ross, in the United States? Right? That's where I was born. Well, I thought you were born in Texas. I was born in Texas, right? So you get that. But it's a way of describing Naharaim is between the 2 rivers, but Aram is the northern part of that. So what happened, and part of the confusion, notice my map says Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia. This is from the Greek, and it became the designation for this area called Naharaim. Naharaim is the 2 rivers. Mesopotamia is similar in that it's from the Greek 2 words, mesos, which means middle, and potemos, which means rivers. So the middle land between the rivers. Now, in the Bible, we don't have Mesopotamia. That is in the Greek Septuagint. whenever the Greek Septuagint, the translators, saw the Hebrew Aram Naharaim, they said Mesopotamos, the middle between the rivers. That's not exactly right. This whole area is Mesopotamia. It's also Naharaim, but this is more, the northern portion is what we would call Aram Naharaim. You've heard of the Arameans, you know? Our father was a wandering Aramean. That's interesting. What does that mean? Is it talking about Avram there? Because that puts him in the north. Okay. Josephus also uses this phrase, this word Mesopotamia, to describe what the Bible calls Aram Naharaim, and it leads people off a little bit. I'm just saying, it's just not, to say Mesopotamia is sort of broad. It's like saying the U.S. It's accurate, but it's not what the Bible has. So we want to recognize this particular area in the north. But again, it's mentioned 5 times. Genesis 24:10, Deuteronomy 23:4, Judges chapter 3, verse 8 and 10, 1 Chronicles 19, verse 6, and Psalm 60 and verse 1. All reference Aram Naharaim. Now, again, Aram Naharaim is the northern portion of the land between 2 rivers. Some have attempted to say that this is no problem. It's not a problem. What they'll say is it's exactly accurate, just like the Bible reports it, that we have Avram and his family go from Ur-Kasdim to Haran. Some say at the collapse of Ur. Some scholars will refer to this when the civilization crumbles, they move, and we can date it, and we can follow the stars in the east and all that. But the idea is that's one view. That's one view, and they say there's no problem. Now, they also say that when we look at chapter 11 and 12, there's no problem. Again, part of the defense, people feel like they have to defend the text because they think if they raise questions that some believe they'll burn in hell, some just believe that they'll be bordering on heresy. The questions that I'm asking are not meant to take away from the beauty and artistry and even the divine nature behind the text, but it's to answer questions. I want to know. I want to know what this text means and what it says and so forth. Now, I want you to pay attention. You ready to do a little bit of math? We've done Latin, we've done Hebrew, we've done Greek. We're going to do some math now. You ready? Put your thinking cap on. In chapter 11 and verse 26, Terach is 70 years old when Avram is born. He's 70. All right, so you want to, I think you trust me, but just so you know, write that verse down, 11:26, and I'll even read it. When Terach had lived 70 years, he begot Avram. Okay? So Avram is born when Terach is 70. Look at verse 32. The days of Terach came to 205 years, and Terach died in Haran. So he's 205. Terach dies at 205. All it takes is that you take 205 and subtract 70, right? And what does that give us? It gives us that 135 years after Avram is born, right, Terach dies. In other words, Avram, by then Abraham, is 135 years old when his father Terach dies. Everybody follow me so far? It's not hard math, or I couldn't do it. He's 205 when he dies. He was 70 when Avram was born. Avram is 135 when his daddy dies. Now, this means that Terach lived 60 years in Haran after Avram leaves. You follow me so far? So this is the interesting piece here, is that Terach lives 60 years after Avram leaves. He lives by himself in Haran. The narrative would lead us to believe that Avram leaves Haran after daddy dies, because it says the days of Terach came to 205 years and Terach died in Haran. The Lord said to Avram, go forth from your native land and from... It's just, so the chronology is not right. Now, how do I know it's not right? Because if you look down, you'll see that Abram is 75. Look at verse 4 of chapter 12. Avram went forth as the Lord had commanded him, and Lot went with him. Avram was 75 years old when he left Haran. He's 75. His daddy's got 60 more years left. Chronology's off. Now, the problem is the difference in narrative order and chronology. People don't like that. They don't want you to know that. Why? I have no idea. Rashi, for instance, he has to come up with an answer, because somebody, one of his bright students, said, wait a minute, the math isn't adding up here, Rabbi. How do you, he's not dead. Next thing you know, Avram is leaving, but it says he's dead, and he's not dead. He won't be dead for another 60 years. Rashi said, relax. The wicked, this is Rashi, the wicked are dead even in their lifetime. So how do we know that Terach is wicked? We don't. The point is, he wants to say that the Bible wants you to know that he was dead already, just a walking dead man, because he's not a righteous person. Okay, I won't go any further. The apologist always look for ways to cover difficulties, but this is a difficulty to cover. What we do know is that in some text, Avram is from Ur Kasdim, and in others, he's from Haran. I'm talking about birthplace. We have two different traditions here. In all of our sources, we know that Avram is from Ur Kasdim. We know that Avram crossed the river Prat. And I believe that that's where we get the idea Ivri. Now some, you can look this up, some will say that it's from a person mentioned one time in the genealogy by the name of Eber. Okay, Eber is from the same root, so, but he's not mentioned as a dominant person, so it'd be 2 or 3 generations before, and you'd say, oh, are you a Hebrew? Yes, I'm a descendant of Eber. But that's one view. But the idea is that what we know, well, what do we know? We know that Abram is from Naharaim. He says, according to the text, he's from Aram Naharaim. He's a wandering Aramaean. And he crosses over. He's the first Hebrew. Now, our sources that make up Eleh Toledoth Terach, at least in part, come from a period after the conquest. What did I just say? Our sources, which were used by the compiler, him or her, to pull this together, the story of the generations of Terach, which is really the story of Avram to Avraham, this is written later than the conquest. It's not written at the time of Abraham. It's not, I mean, there could be sources that go back that old. Let me make that clear. Could be written sources, could be oral stories. There are debates on that both ways. but the sources are old. I'm not denying that. But it goes beyond the time of Moses, for sure. Just a couple of points to bring up to make sure you see that. Chapter 12, verse 6 of Genesis. Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem at the terebinth of Moreh. The Canaanites were then in the land. And guess what? The Canaanites were then in the land in Moses' time too. So a contemporary writer with Moses' time wouldn't say that. You get what I'm saying? In other words, of course they were, and they will remain so until after the conquest. So it's at least 40 years after, and go read your Bible and figure out how long the Canaanites were in the land. Whoever wrote this part, at least this verse, and I think more, but whoever wrote at least this part is writing at a time when the Canaanites are no longer in the land. Because they're saying, at that time there were Canaanites in the land. And you'd go, really? Canaanites were in the land? Yeah, there really were. Okay, look down at chapter 13 and verse 7. And there was quarreling between the herdsmen of Avram's cattle and those of Lot's cattle. The Canaanites and Perizzites were then dwelling in the land. You see, it's another clue. This is written later. It's an anachronism. It's called backwards time. It's where a writer in a later period is telling a story. Now, we get this all the time. We also know that things aren't chronological. We get spoilers in the story that give us clues that something's coming. Let me give you an example. In chapter 13, one of the things that's going on is the quarreling between Lot and Lot's cattle people and Avram's, the herdsmen and so forth, and they're debating, look down, and then they have to pick. The land can't support both of them. So Avram goes to Lot. He says, look, you pick. You go this way, I'll go that way. We need to split up. And look at verse 10. It says, Lot looked about him and saw how well watered was the whole plain of the Jordan, the Kikar HaYordan, the circle of the Jordan, all of it. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Yeah, sure is, because we don't even know what you're talking about. Not until chapter 19 when Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed, right? So it's like a person reading this ought to go, what? But it's okay. I mean, it's natural in a story. In my book, I wrote, and you need to watch for this. This is coming. You just give them a little bit. It's actually beautiful the way they did it. It's beautiful the way I did mine too. Just joking. There's also the use of the divine name that clues us in. Again, Exodus chapter 6, verse 2 and 3, we've covered this ad nauseum. Is that another Latin phrase? But in Exodus 6, 2 and 3, it says that God is speaking. He said, by my name, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, I was not known to the fathers, but I was known by El Shaddai. And yet, throughout Eleh Toledoth Terach, we have over and over a mixture. Sometimes the name El in various forms, sometimes Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Also, we have place names that are indications of a later hand. So in Genesis 14:14, when Lot, you remember the Battle of the Kings in Genesis 14, and all these different 10 kings come together in the valley and they're fighting, and then ultimately Lot and his family are kidnapped and snatched away, and Abraham loads up 318 people and they go get the boy and his family. They rescue him. It says he goes all the way to Dan, and that's in Genesis 14:14. But Dan doesn't exist yet as a name. So let me show you this real quickly. Go to Joshua chapter 19, Joshua 19 and verse 47. It says, but the territory of the Danites slipped from their grasp, so the Danites migrated and made war on Leshem. Some texts say Laish. They captured it and put it to the sword. They took possession of it and settled in it, and they changed the name Leshem to Dan after their ancestor Dan. This was the portion of the tribe of the Danites by their clans, those towns, and their villages. The other text that I'll show you is in Judges 18 In other words, the name of the place, Dan, didn't exist in that time. So it's okay. It's like using the later name. It's an anachronism. But Judges 18, verse 26 says the following: So Micah, realizing that they were stronger than he, turned back, went home, and the Danites went on their way, taking the things Micah had made and the priest he had acquired. They proceeded to Laish. Remember, our Joshua text said Leshem. A people tranquil and unsuspecting, and they put them to the sword and burned down the town. There was none to come to rescue, for it was distant from Sidon, and they had no dealings with anyone. It lay in the valley of Beit Rehob. They rebuilt the town, settled there, and they named the town Dan after their ancestor Dan, who was Israel's son. Originally, however, the name of the town was Laish. So when Avram chases down the kidnappers to get Lot back, he goes not to Dan. If it has said, hey, which way is it to Dan? That has said, I don't know what you're talking about. What's somewhere up here, Laish? Yeah, Laish, that's it. Yeah, what's right here? See, it's not known. So we have those examples. Now, the material covered in this parsha would take 5 weeks to go through according to the ancient cycle of readings. I've got to go through quite a bit, real rapid fire here, but I'll pick up some of this in another class. But we have 5 sections. If we look at the Torah reading today, and we looked at it according to the annual cycle, which we are, and then we looked at it compared to the triennial cycle, the triennial would take 5 weeks. And it covers a lot. Covers the call of Abraham to the split with Lot, the war of the kings, Melchizedek, the vision of Avram and the pieces divided, the passing between the pieces, the quarrel of the 2 women, the appearance of Avraham or appearance to Avraham in chapter 17, the covenant of circumcision, and so forth and so on. Now, a lot of people might say, well, that's kind of what I logged into here. Everybody's doing that. So I want to cover some different things. But just a few highlights, if you will. In the first reading, we have this call of Abram, who is called to leave the land. Now, we already talked about the difficulty there with the dating. When is it? Where is he? Is he in Ur when he gets chapter 12 call, or is he in Haran? All right? You have to look at that, make that decision. But in that call, a series of blessings, and I will bless you, and I will bless those who bless you. And the English usually says, curse those who curse you. It's not what it says. Curse those who esteem you lightly. So Abraham's descendants, and again, people tend to think of Israel and the Jews in this sense, but we need to be careful. Abraham's descendants are much wider than that. You're going to see this as we work through. A lot of people just say, well, it went to Isaac and Ishmael, and it went to Jacob and Esau is, be careful, be careful. That's all I'm saying. We have to look at this very closely, and we will as we work through. But one of the promises is land not only to Avram and his seed, see, it's to his descendants, which are much broader than people of the biblical persuasion tend to give. In chapter 13, verses 14 through 7, it's another encounter that Avram has with God. And there he tells him, your descendants will be as the dust of the ground. Can you count the dust? That's a lot of descendants, right? Now remember, he doesn't even have any kids at this time. Then we get into, as we work through quickly, Melchizedek. Melchizedek in chapter 14. Who is this Melchizedek? Some people say, oh, it's Shem. Melchizedek, you can do the math and it adds up. We don't get that from the text. That's somebody's idea. They're just giving you their opinion. And that's fine. Some people believe that it's a pre-incarnate Messiah. That's not in the text either. It's in the book of Hebrews in the Christian writings, but it's not in the Torah. It's not in the Pentateuch, but it's an opinion. You can say, well, that's okay too. Well, it's okay for people to have opinions. What I try to avoid is having an opinion which is not supported by the text. You know, if somebody goes, well, that's what I believe. There you go. Then you have at it. But it's not in the text. In fact, we meet this Melchizedek in Genesis 14, and we only see Melchizedek another time in Psalm 110. So you can put those two together, which is what most people do from the Dead Sea Scrolls through Christianity, through the book of Hebrews, and they all look at it and they come out with these different views. But the Salem that's mentioned, he's the king of Salem. He's a priest of El Elyon, and he's from Salem. Where is Salem? Well, according to Psalm 76:3, seems to be another ancient name for Jerusalem. Could be. I tend to lean that way. Okay? Again, we have the first, in this reading, the first occurrence of the term Hebrew. Whether that is, as I've shared, some people believe it means a descendant of Eber, this obscure person who's only mentioned there. Could be. But it seems to me that I would follow the majority of the scholars on this view, that it means one who crossed over, indicating his place of origin is beyond the great river. In chapter 15, we have another covenant text, basically. We have not only God appearing to Avram, El Shaddai appearing to Avram and making this plan known to Avram, but he also tells him of a dark time in the very near future for his descendants, a time he'll go to his grave in peace, we learn, but his descendants will go for some 400 years and be oppressed and so forth. And by the way, we're going to talk about that as I wind down. But in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 6, he's just been brought outside in this visionary experience, and he's been shown the stars of the heaven, just like the dust of the earth in chapter 13, verse 14 through 17. He's shown now the stars. And the stars don't look like they look in your big city with all the lights. This is beautiful. If you've ever been on the ocean at night, or if you've been in a dark country place and looked at the stars. Can you count them? This is what your seed will be. Now, Abram still doesn't have any children. And it says, and he believed, or he trusted in what God said, and that was counted to him for righteousness. We don't know why God called Avram. It wasn't because he was smashing idols in his daddy's workshop. That's just a story. It's somebody's opinion. It's just made up. But what we do know is that he becomes the great iconoclastic model, because he goes from many gods to one God. He accepts the call to leave your father's house, your homeland, everything that you know, and go to a place that I'll show you, and I'll multiply you. I'll bless you and multiply you. And he believed God, even though this is a long time later and he still doesn't have any kids. But because he trusted, it was counted to him for righteousness. The next reading that we would go through, if we work through it, all of it, is this fight between the two women. Proverbs chapter 30, verse 23 says that one of the three things that causes the earth to tremble is not when women fight, but when a servant takes the upper hand, right? And that's what happens in this story. She conceives, and then there's a problem. And now what Genesis 16 doesn't say, it doesn't make Hagar into this lower earthly nothing and Sarah into the upper. You know, later Christian thought would develop this idea that Sarah represents the Jerusalem above, and Hagar's this lower base, you know, that old Arab woman, that Egyptian slave. In fact, it goes so far as to say that's what the law is, right? I know people are saying, you don't understand it. You have to really understand Paul. I think I got it. The idea is not that in the Pentateuch. Avram loves Hagar, and he loves Ishmael. I don't agree with the way he treated them, But he does. And it's a hurtful thing for him that this fight has happened. But there is a promised seed. And the seed through which the ultimate plan will be played out, not at the exclusion of Ishmael and his descendants. They too will be blessed. They too will be multiplied. But it's through Isaac that the plan will pass, but the plan involves all man, see? You don't discount Ishmael. You don't discount Esau. That's where people mess up. And that's where it becomes this racist, ethnic issue where people say, I hate all Arabs. Well, you're just not biblical. And you better be careful. Now, just under the surface of the story of Hagar, and just under the story of the debate between Hagar and them, I want you to understand, Hagar, they probably picked Hagar up when they sojourned into Egypt. You know, when God makes the deal with Abram, you leave and come to this land, you know, almost right after he gets there, there's a famine in the land. Can you imagine? Abraham's like, I left the land of two rivers, and I've come here. It's hot as Hades. There's no food. It doesn't rain. I think I'll go to Egypt. He isn't even there. He just barely gets there. He's got to leave. But he's following the promise. He trusts God. And this is a good lesson for us. Trust God, but go where there's food, right? Don't just sit there and starve. Well, God sent me here, brother. Well, God sent you there, but He also knows you got to eat. Sarah degrades Hagar. And I don't like that about Sarah. I know a lot of people want to defend every action of their biblical hero or heroine, but that's not right. Degrades Hagar in chapter 16, verse 6. And you know, the same word for degrading that Sarah did to Hagar is exactly what Egypt will later do to Sarah's descendants in Exodus chapter 1, verse 12. Let me tell you something. There's a consequence. There's cause and effect are real. As Hagar flees in the wilderness from her mistress, so too will Israel flee from Egypt into the wilderness. A lot of crossover there between the story. You reap what you sow, and sometimes that reaping takes place generationally. Sometimes we do things so badly that it has repercussions on those who follow. Genesis 17 is more covenant. We'll be pulling from these texts as we build on the story of Abraham. But in 17 we have an interesting thing because God calls Abram and He says, walk before me and be perfect, I think is the King James. Walk before me is the same description. God is telling Avram to do that, or Abraham at the time, but it's what Enoch did, and it's what Noah did, and that's why they were considered righteous. Avram is told, here's the model. Go do it. And he trusts God. At the beginning of the Parsha, Avram is told, Lech Lecha, walk for yourself. And he's supposed to go to a place that he hadn't even been shown. He's never even seen it. And he does. It says, Lech Lecha, walk for yourself. And then next verse 4 says, and he walked. So he's obedient. Avram is on the move throughout. He's a wandering Aramean. You know, we don't know why he was chosen by reading the story. We really don't. It's not, as far as we know, because of his walk with the true God or for his disdain for idols. He was an idolater, and he's told to walk with God. At this point in our unfolding narrative of Eleh Toledoth Terach, we have a family of idolaters who leave Naharaim, Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, and we have the one true God call Avram to leave everything that he knows and to go to a life of unknowns. And Abram does it. Promises are made, but at this point in our unfolding narrative, they are yet unfulfilled. And by the way, they will remain unfulfilled for decades. Rather than receive the promises, he faces famine almost immediately, barrenness of a woman. She's supposed to bring him multitudes, and she can't have a child. And then he has women fighting. I mean, he inherits a real package there. And yet, despite all of that, Avram trusts. This trust is what counted to him for righteousness. Avram was uncircumcised and part of a family of idolaters. When he crossed over, they worshiped other gods. Avram chose the one God, e pluribus unum. Out of many, he chose one. All our character awaits, trustingly, by the way, is for God to multiply him, to cause him to go from one to many, ex uno multis. This is what he's waiting on. And we're going to get to that beginning next week. Thanks for joining me. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov.